Greetings. My name is Cameron Miller, and this is coming to you from Trinity Place in Geneva, New York. Today, we're going to start with particle physics before leaping into metaphysics. But this is not but that's not really accurate, because what I know about physics would begin to fill even a little thimble, which also describes the amount of my interest in metaphysics. But to begin, there was a fascinating article recently in the New York Times, especially good because it wasn't about the pandemic. The headline, or the title, if you want to look it up, is The Rebel Physicist on the Hunt for a Better Story Than Quantum Mechanics. A little light reading. It's about Italian physicist Angelo Bassi, who is making the case that orthodox quantum theory is woefully incomplete. So allow me to quote the article that explains why quantum theory has a big hole in it. Because, while it's spectacular at making predictions, the article says, it doesn't describe what's actually happening underneath nature's hood to make those results come about. It would be one thing, the article goes on, to concede that science may never be able to explain, say, the subjective experiences of the human mind, but the standard take on quantum mechanics suggests that something far more surprising, that a complete understanding of even the objective physical world is beyond science's reach, since it's impossible to translate into words how the theory's math relates to the world we live in. If we adapted that sentence, that was the end of the quotation. If we adapted that sentence to theology, it would say, a complete understanding of even the objective physical world is beyond the reach of theology, since it is impossible to translate into words how God relates to the world we live in. For example, we can easily echo Isaiah that we heard this morning, that God is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end of all that is. But what real impact that has on life as we live it remains an utter, perhaps unsolvable mystery. What if, when it comes to spirituality, as with physics and economics, there is the macro and the micro. And often the two do not seem to connect with each other. And now enter Jesus. We have before us a parable that has been so well chewed by the oral tradition, by which I mean that river of years meandering from the death of Jesus to when Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John edited his words. That river of time is anywhere from 40 to 80 years long, with Jesus' sayings and stories moving around as free-floating radicals among thousands of villages, towns, and cities across the first and into the second century. So when we come to a parable like we have today, whatever Jesus' original intent or meaning was, it is now lost to us forever. But that said, like quantum physics, because we don't know everything does not mean we don't know some things. Here's one of the things we do know. Matthew took a parable reported to have come from Jesus and turned it into an allegory about apocalypse, the so-called second coming of Jesus. Now, the lectionary includes Matthew's long allegorizing of the parable, which I eliminated today in favor of holding up the remains of the parable from Jesus. You may want to go back and look at the whole thing. I don't know. He will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead, is one of the lines of the Nicene Creed. He will come again, meaning Jesus, in glory to judge the living and the dead. Now, that being one of the lines on the Nicene Creed, many of us choke on it. The idea that Jesus will arrive at the end of history to separate the good guys from the bad guys is difficult. It's also, by the way, an part of Orthodox Islamic doctrine. But it doesn't rest very easy with a modernist view of the cosmos, which includes quantum physics. So I'm more comfortable with the modernist tradition of biblical scholarship that does not see anything in the teachings of Jesus to suggest that he actually thought that he was coming back when the clock stopped ticking. That said, some of the gospel editors clearly believed Jesus was going to be back. And they engaged in some expansive interpretation of those free-floating Jesus sayings in order to get there, to make their point, to prove their case. We know that Jesus' stories and parables circulated by word of mouth for 2 to 3 generations before they were ever written down. And over the course of that span of years, the world changed dramatically. In short, the world Jesus lived and died in was really quite different from the world that the gospel editors lived and died in. And my favorite way to understand this, I call the James theory. I was born in 1953, and my youngest child, James, was born in 1994. That's roughly the span of time that passed between Jesus' death and then when the Gospel of Mark was written. So think about how much the world changed between 1953 and 1994. Think how the presumptions of my world are so different from the presumptions of James's world. The Cold War, the crumbling of colonialism, the expansion and then decline of communism, the receding of nationalized economies and the birth of globalism, the globalization of American culture and then the evaporation of American dominance, space travel, earth travel, Studebaker to Prius, mainframe computers that filled a warehouse reduced to a laptop and then again to a tablet-sized computing, and now a phone with nearly as much speed and memory as those old mainframes. From industrialization to the explosion of information to the crisis of climate change, that was 1953 to 1994, 41 brief years. Now, add another 10 years to that, which may be the length of time between Mark and Matthew writing their Gospels. In the James illustration, it would be the change in the world between the first 2 years of the Clinton presidency and post 9/11 world of Bush's invasion of Iraq, Abu Ghraib, and the landing on Mars. This could go on, naming how the world has changed and how many human assumptions have changed with it. Let's not make the mistake of modernist hubris, in which we say to ourselves that our world is changing so much faster than the world of Jesus' day, and that the New Testament writers, writing 40 to 80 years after Jesus, wouldn't have had that different of a world. While our rate of technological change is light years more rapid than theirs, history always races by from the perspective of those who are living in it. You see, between Jesus and Matthew, there opened up a chasm as wide as the one between my world and James's. It was a war of Jewish insurrection against Roman domination, and it led to the near elimination of what Jesus had come to know as Judaism, a religion that was nearly extinguished altogether from that war. The social and political landscape changed radically from Jesus to Matthew. And if we do not know about those changes, then we cannot fully understand the gospel. Matthew and his Jewish contemporaries believed that they were living close to the apocalypse, at the near end of history. because all that they had known had changed as a result of this brutal war. But the world Jesus lived in was still open-ended and full of possibilities. That difference alone shows how Jesus' parable evolved into a metaphor about Christian community, even though Christians and Christianity did not exist when Jesus walked the earth. As told by Matthew, Jesus' parable deals with the question of how something so good like church can have such yucky people in it. Yes, even way back then, some Christians were trying to figure out how those other Christians could be Christian. Matthew was concerned about how Christians define themselves over and against the world. He wanted to make clear that Christians are the good guys and the rest of the world are the bad guys. But if that's true, Matthew wondered, then how do some of those bad guys get into the good guys club? If they get in, does that spoil the goodness of the whole club? So the answer that Matthew came up with, of course, is the devil did it. A mysterious enemy snuck in by night and planted the bad guys. If you want to read the second half of today's lectionary post, that's how Matthew interpreted the parable Jesus had told 50 years earlier. But strip away the presumptions of Matthew's world and remember that for Jesus, there was no such thing as church, and there were no such thing as Christians. And even the fiery idea of apocalypse was not as present for Jesus as Matthew. And remembering all that, we then might hear a different punchline to the parable. In other words, if we shift the context of the parable away from Matthew's post-Jewish Roman war and we listen to it back in Jesus' day, what we notice right away is that the workers are downright edgy and anxious when they go out and find weeds in the field. And that's an important clue as to what the parable was about when Jesus told it. Remember, they're peasants, tenant farmers, and so they're worried about being blamed and punished for crop failure. They know they're innocent. They know they didn't plant bad seeds. So they start calculating the possibilities like the fox sniffing hounds in the wind. They race through questions in their minds. Does the presence of bad weeds mean the farmer mixed the weeds in with the seeds? Will we be blamed? Maybe people will think that we pocketed some of the good seed for our own plots and then filled in with weeds. Should we purify the field now, protect what good seeds are left so that we don't get blamed for the bad? They anxiously question the integrity of the farmer, raise doubts about their own credibility with others, and they worry about what to do now. We know from our own experiences that the presence of ugliness and evil causes us to be anxious and to question any goodness that we may have presumed. So if we're not focusing on apocalypse, here's what I think Jesus is telling us. The farmer enters the scene. The farmer owns the land. The farmer owns the peasants. The farmer owns the produce. The farmer is sovereign, the Alpha and the Omega, as far as the peasants are concerned. The farmer tells the peasants what to do. Don't purify the field, he says to the farmers. You have no idea what is a weed and what is potential fruit. Leave it alone and let the harvesters deal with it. To the anxious hand-wringing of what-ifs of the vulnerable peasants and their knee-jerk temptation to separate the good from the bad, Jesus has an entirely different strategy. Let's think about that parable on the micro level. We have character defects, you and I. At least I'm assuming you do. I know I do. All of us, right? We all have defects of character. We all have significant problems that keep reemerging in our lives, like mildew keeps coming back. We have painful limitations and flaws, ones that have followed or cursed us throughout our whole lives. They're the weeds that won't disappear no matter how much we work at it, any more than plastic surgery will really overcome aging. So to this weediness of ours, those ugly and embarrassing parts of ourselves that have become entangled with the fruit that we bear, Jesus whispers, don't purge yourself. What you think is a weed may actually be fruit. Live with it. Watch it grow. Tend to it. Let it be. One day, God will wipe away every tear. And then you will know peace. For now, let it be. So, here's what I take away from this parable. Most of what we struggle with was planted there at the beginning, or deposited along the way by others, and we'll not get rid of it. In other words, the problems that we're born with are the problems we're going to die with. Live with them. Learn from them. Grow with them. Find ways to compensate for them. Seek to live non-anxiously alongside them. Assume that God one day will heal us with unspeakable love. But until then, make do with the presence of weeds, because we're not a perfect garden. But we are from God and of God, and we belong to God. Thanks be to God. Thanks for listening. Peace be with you.